phenomenon of companies who think it's a good idea to go woke in order to distract from the mistreatment of their customers. And so we launched last year with ad campaigns against Nike and Coca-Cola and American Airlines. We've also done Ticketmaster and MLB. And then we've also done a company that's not as well known, BlackRock. We've been continuing to hammer them because, as you asked about education, they are probably one of the most powerful companies in the world the average person has never heard of. And we thought they should not get away with their corruption and their misdeeds simply by way of their obscurity. And so we wanted to make sure that the average consumer understood how their interests were being undermined by BlackRock and its CEO, Larry Fink.
Yeah, one of the more recent articles that I saw on your website was about Larry Fink, kind of explaining who he is. Could you maybe explain for people who don't know exactly what he is or what he's been doing, just who Larry Fink is?
Certainly. Well, Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock, and BlackRock is the largest investment management company in the world. It manages $10 trillion in assets. That's everything from state and local pension funds, workers' 401ks, worker pension funds from private companies, university endowments. And also they manage the thrift savings plan of the federal government. So they manage federal pensions. They have a ton of money that they manage. And what comes with that, the control of those assets, is the control over the shares that they buy. So, for example, they control about 7.5% of the shares of Exxon, and they have a right to vote those shares as a fiduciary. Unfortunately, what they utilize that power to do is to betray the very American citizens and specifically the American consumers that they're supposed to be serving. Larry Fink is very vocal about injecting his personal politics into the management of BlackRock and into the use of the assets that they control. And so we've been calling them out for that, helping to educate the consumer as to how their interests are being undermined, educate state officials like the governor of Florida, the treasurer of West Virginia, for example, are two state actors who've taken action after we've you sent them letters on the issue of how their own state's pension funds were being misused against the interests of the citizens of their state. So Larry Fink is basically a political. He's trying to turn BlackRock and corporate America into a political utility for the Democratic Party.
So in those terms, as a lot of businesses like BlackRock and other large corporations are leveraging kind of the political scene for their benefit, how do you, besides just educating the consumer, in the bigger picture, how do you think people should be fighting back against that to basically, tell corporations, get out of politics, stay in your lane?
That is a great question because it really is a multi-front issue.
Right.
Obviously, if you don't like Nike shoes, you can just stop buying Nike shoes. But unfortunately, in the case of BlackRock, you may live if you live in the right municipality in the right state, your local municipality's pension fund might be with BlackRock. Your state's pension fund might be managed by BlackRock. And of course, as I mentioned already, the federal government's pension fund is managed by BlackRock. So at every level, you might have actual government funds that supposedly represent you are being used against your interests. And so that's really the beginning of the conversation, is to educate consumers and citizens about this issue and then have them in turn communicate to their elected officials that this is something that they care about. I think it's an issue that has grown as a problem because the average person has not been aware of it. In fact, I'd say the average politician probably wasn't aware of it. I think it speaks to that when last year we put together a 4-page study on BlackRock's entanglements with China, and I can go into that in a moment. And we sent that to the states, the governors of the states with the top 10 amounts of money being managed by BlackRock, at least according to their financial disclosures. And within 2 weeks, Governor DeSantis had revoked every fund manager's right to vote the proxies of the pension funds in Florida. And he'd asked for a top-to-bottom audit of every Chinese asset that the Florida pension fund was invested in. And then following on a few months later, as I alluded, the West Virginia treasurer, Riley Moore, declared that they would be divesting every asset that he had control over as treasurer from BlackRock because of BlackRock's actions. And I should maybe speak a little bit in specificity as to the kinds of things that BlackRock's doing. So kind of talking in vagaries of how they're undermining our interests. But BlackRock is committed to a type of investing called ESG, which is, at least on paper, the idea that you rate companies, grade companies based on a number of different sort of unorthodox issues. For example, how well the company would fare if you take climate change as a given, and then they use that as reasoning to either reward or punish these companies' managements, whether they follow along with this. So in the context of, say, Exxon, which I mentioned before, last year, BlackRock used their 7% that they control to help elect 3 radical environmentalists to the board of that company. And the stated goal of these new directors is to get Exxon out of focusing on serving cheap, reliable gas to American consumers and onto, all this weird. Actually, they want them to hit the Paris Accord. Of course, America has withdrawn from the Paris Accords. They're trying to force the company to meet those standards, net zero carbon by 2050, which of course is going to increase greatly the cost on consumers and is going to decrease the reliability of the supply of energy. So these are the types of things specifically that BlackRock is using America's investment dollars to do here in the United States. And like I said, states like Florida and West Virginia, as soon as they heard about it, said, we don't want any part of this. And there's other states that are starting to catch on. Arizona's treasurer just announced something similar. Texas has passed a law that if you declare as a matter of policy that your company is divesting of oil and gas, well, then they're going to divest of you. The state is not going to do business with that company anymore. So these are some of the things that BlackRock is up to. And our hope is that as we get the word out, as you noted, you'll see more and more public officials figuring out how they can follow their democratic responsibility to protect their citizens, while BlackRock is out breaching its fiduciary responsibility to its investors.
You talked about Exxon specifically. Obviously, gas prices are something that we're all dealing with right now. There's a myriad of reasons that they are through the roof, but what kind of effect does this sort of action from BlackRock kind of have, like you said, on consumers? Is it making it, even worse? Gas prices, is it obviously contributing? How much do you think is it really doing that?
That is a great question, and I've got a couple of points I'll bring up on that. One, so I mentioned those new directors that were elected to the board of Exxon. Shortly after that, this was like in May of last year. By October of last year, the Wall Street Journal was reporting on conversations were being had inside the board of Exxon on whether they should divest themselves of 2 of their newest oil and gas projects, one in Mozambique, one in Vietnam, that represented over $30 billion of capital expenditures and American know-how that had already been invested in developing these projects. And because of these new activist board members, they were considering divesting themselves of the projects. Well, it's not just a matter of what that means to Exxon shareholders, who understandably probably aren't too happy about it either, but we as consumers should be very concerned about that, because what that means is if they sell those assets, they're going to go to foreign companies, probably Chinese companies, an economy that is starved for energy and oil and gas. And instead of that going to American consumers and lowering the price at the pump, it's going to go lower the price at the pump in Shanghai and Beijing. As far as the effect that it's having, I will note there's a energy consultancy company called Rystad Energy, and they noted at the end of last year that 2021 marked a 75-year low in new oil and gas energy deposit discovery. So because of the restrictions on new investment into oil and gas discovery going on by BlackRock and companies like BlackRock, it is really having a strangling effect on new oil and gas discovery. And unfortunately, it's not one of those situations. It takes a number of years to go from discovering new oil and gas, developing the project, getting the financing, getting the boots on the ground, all the engineering. I mean, this is a multi-year process. So if you have a bottleneck in the chain, like we've had for the last couple of years, this could be increasing our price at the pump for the next decade. The effects of Larry Fink and BlackRock's actions. So I don't know exactly, whether it's $1, whether it's 50 cents, but it is having an effect. It's restricting the supply. And I will note, this might be a good moment to speak about some of the effect, some of their entanglements with China. I mentioned all this ESG stuff they use as a stalking horse to push their left-wing politics onto corporate America here in the United States. Well, BlackRock also invests billions and billions and billions of dollars into the Chinese economy. And they don't do any of that bullying with them over there in China. Explicitly, BlackRock says, and this is pretty laughable, BlackRock says that because China is still a developing economy, it would be unfair to apply the same ESG rules to them as it would to us. Now, of course, they quote the per capita GDP figures of China, but there are economists now who say that China's total GDP has now overcome the United States. They are the world's largest economy. So it's it's obscene, really, to say that China should be playing by a different set of rules than the United States. It's bad enough that they're here, bullying our corporations, taking their eye off the ball of serving the American consumer, but they're over there playing by a completely different set of rules, sucking up to the Chinese Communist Party. And so it's really a 1-2 punch to the American consumer. They're hurting corporations here. They're helping the Chinese economy. I mentioned those 2 projects in Mozambique and Vietnam. They very well may be responsible for those projects being handed over to a Chinese oil company, and I'll just pick one out of a hat, PetroChina, which coincidentally BlackRock owns about the same amount of as they own Exxon. So they could financially benefit from the very thing that they've done.
Well, going off of that, though, I kind of want to ask the question of how realistic is it to, spur these companies into stop being woke? Because at the end of the day, a lot of these companies are adopting these ideologies. If you look at ESGs, for instance, they're a phenomenal way to make money, especially if you short them. So how realistic is it to actually try to push these companies to stop pursuing what they're pursuing politically? Because it hurts the consumer, of course, but it makes them money at the same time because this is helping them control different markets.
Well, that's a great question, and it depends on the company you're talking about. I think there's a number of companies, specifically the ones that we've attacked, who are simply gone woke because it was politically expedient. Take the case of American Airlines. Okay, this is Wall Street Journal has rated that airline the worst in the nation 2 years in a row.
That's pretty bad.
They were second to last for like the 13 years prior to that. So it's just long trajectory of not doing a good job. They lose the most bags. They kick the most passengers off of flights involuntarily. And then because of COVID, I should take that back. Arguably because of COVID, they needed a multi-billion-dollar taxpayer-funded bailout in 2020, and then that same year they turned around and gave their CEO, their failing CEO, Doug Parker, who they've since canned, an 8-figure, $10 million plus paycheck in the form of stock options. So they would rather talk about anything, right, rather than all of those failures. And I'll even just pile on since we have time to discuss it. I mentioned supposedly needed a bailout. When Doug Parker, 4 years prior to COVID, American Airlines had $5.5 billion in the bank. Okay, all of Doug Parker's compensation comes from stock options. In the 4 years lead up to COVID, he spent $5 billion of that doing stock buybacks to pump up the American Airlines stock price, and therefore put more zeros on his own paycheck. So, but by the time they got to COVID, they had more money in the bank 5 years prior than the bailout they needed to keep operating. The only reason they needed a bailout is that Doug had drained the coffers in order to put money in his pocket. So I'll just add that as another reason he did not want a lot of people talking about the performance of the company. He'd much rather grandstand around Texas election legislation and try to distract. Coca-Cola and Nike both have serious issues, and this is according to Congress, with the use of forced labor to make their products in mainland China. In fact, at the same time that they were grandstanding, both those companies were grandstanding about the Georgia election integrity legislation, they were quietly lobbying to amend a bill that was moving through Congress that would prevent products made with forced labor from entering the U.S. market. They were trying to lobby to get their products accepted from that legislation because they knew that they couldn't qualify in those situations. So it sounds like they've got so many millions of dollars, and these guys are so powerful. And these are very spineless, cynical people. And so when you come after them, you say, listen, it's not going to work. You can try to distract from, your use of forced labor or, using taxpayer bailouts to put zeros on your paycheck. But we're going to call you out. We're going to name and shame you. And so there's no reason to do it because it's going to end up worse for you by doing that. So I'm actually very optimistic about how much can be changed. And then just to get back to BlackRock a little bit. Since we started attacking him in October, he has been backpedaling about as fast as humanly possible. So Larry Fink sends out an annual, this is speaks to his insane hubris, but Larry Fink, an investment manager, sends an annual letter to CEOs, all CEOs, like all of corporate America, every year about what he wants to see them do. Basically, it's his just bloviation on, corporate America should do this and do that. Okay. If you go read the last 3 or 4, not this year's, but the prior, it's just progressive politics, climate change, everything. He spent the first third of this year's walking back a number of the things that he has said. In fact, he specifically stated, what we're doing isn't politics, it's not ideological, and it's not woke. He actually said that. So I think that suggests that they are very nervous about the attention that they are suddenly getting. And then on top of that, for the first time, they've started collecting little rent-a-Republicans like Dahlia Blass out of the SEC to head their government affairs department. And she's now she got caught writing a letter quietly on behalf of BlackRock to the state of Texas. They sent it to the legislators, local banks there, claiming that BlackRock is actually the best friend that oil and gas has ever had. And noting all of the oil and gas companies that they're invested in. And get this this blows your mind, the hypocrisy. Number 1 on the list was they talked about how much Exxon stock they own. So they're literally taking the stock that they own and using it to destroy the company. And then when they get heat for that, they're saying, no, we don't hate oil and gas. Look how much Exxon stock we own. Yeah, they're using it to destroy the company. And to distract from the way they're taking the eye off the ball of customers. So I do think it suggests I don't think it's genuine. I don't think we're certainly not letting up. I think they're two-faced. And I say as soon as the coast is clear that they'll put the knife right back to the throat of the oil and gas industry and betray America's consumers again. But I do think it suggests that we're having a significant impact, that they feel this is necessary. In fact, they seem to be sort of on a whirlwind publicity tour with the oil and gas industry. The one of the other co-founders, in addition to Larry, was just down at the TIPRO conference, which is, I apologize, I can't remember the exact acronym, but it's one of the oil producer associations. They had a conference just this week in Austin, Texas, and he went to speak. And you may have noted that was where he made those comments that kind of became infamous, where he said that this is an incredibly entitled generation that thinks that they just expect to go to a grocery store and see food. And go to a gas station and have gas. And, it's just it's insane what these people expect, right?
So entitled.
Shock, right, exactly. Outside of that conference, you would have seen 2 mobile billboards going around the conference and another 2 going around the State House from Consumers Research, reminding the state officials in Texas and the people at TIPRO that the Larry Fink and BlackRock and the guy, this guy, Robert, I can't remember his name, but they have been, at the same time, they've been hampering United States corporation oil production. They've been helping Putin and Xi, produce there. So our billboard said, our enemy, their allies, about BlackRock. So I do think there's some significant indication that they are very, very worried, and we're going to keep the heat on.
Yeah, I think that's important because, like you said, all these companies, obviously, they've got a lot of resources. They're good at putting out this propaganda. Obviously, when they made those comments about the entitled generation, those went pretty viral for being ridiculous. But I think usually, for the most part, they're a lot better at kind of tricking Americans into believing that what they're doing is actually helping them or that they're doing the right thing. How do you guys kind of use your resources, use what you have to kind of wake people up to that and say, what these companies are saying is not true?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and certainly it's always nice when they help us out by making comments like you made earlier this week.
And they
just
shoot
show
themselves in the foot.
how exactly, and they show how out of touch they are, and just how much disdain. I think that's one of the things that it's hard for people, the average person, to wrap their head around sometimes. That someone like Larry Fink or someone like that gentleman would have such a disdain for the average person. That they would, basically, they're sitting up there, Wall Street fat cats. They have, they're members of the 3 Comma Club, as they like to say, literal billionaires. Yes. And they're calling us entitled. And they manage public money. They made this money, they made their own personal finances, being a fiduciary for, state, local, federal pension funds, people, workers, 401ks. So it certainly helps when they make the case for you about how malevolent they are. But, I think you mentioned the other section of these ESG funds, and the number of them, the number of funds that are now rebranding as ESG or moving into that space. I think that's a great point. One of the things we try to help people understand is that the reason that that's happening is not because suddenly these people, just wake up every morning and wish they could work at a charity. And so this is their idea of doing that. There's been a multi-decade trend in Wall Street moving towards what they call passive investing, meaning instead of hiring a mutual fund or a hedge fund who usually charges a lot more or a lot of money to do this, to manage your assets, you buy an index, which is just like the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones. It's a list of companies that are supposed to be broadly representative of the American economy, or at least the American economy that's publicly traded. There's a lot of research that suggests that it's, once you account for the amount you have to pay these activist managers that make specific decisions, you're better off just investing in the broad economy through index funds. And so that's there's been a huge shift, almost more and more assets every year are managed that way. And the problem for Wall Street for that is that the expense ratios, the fees that they're allowed to charge you, or that they're able to charge you at market going rate, have come down tremendously, down to where you're basically, you can get a S&P 500 index fund for less than 10 basis points. That's like less than 0.1% of your money every year is what they would charge you to do that. And so these funds are just begging for a reason to charge their clients more money. And so ESG for Larry is a great excuse to inject his politics. For a lot of Wall Street, it's a great excuse to bump up those expense ratios, because they're telling you, listen, you need us to do this. The ESG stuff's very complicated. You need, Wall Street, you need to put on our little green visors, and you need us to do all this crazy scoring. And, you can't do that on your own, so pay us, instead of 10 basis points, maybe pay us 30 or 40. Some of these funds charge 3, 4, 5 times what the, equivalent index would charge. And so it's created a huge incentive for a lot of funds to simply rebrand as ESG and then bump up the fees. There's a left-wing publication called Eco Business that canvassed the thousands of funds last year that rebranded as ESG and bumped up their fees. And according to them, 86% of those funds, after rebranding, didn't change a single asset allocation. They didn't change anything they were invested in. They simply just slapped ESG on the label, bumped up the expense ratios, and so it's for a lot of this. It's just an excuse to charge consumers more money, and that's another reason we're trying to raise the alarm. It's just fraud. It's just telling customers you're doing something for them and really not doing anything at all. And so that's a big part of it. Is unfortunately it's just Wall Street greed once again, pushing a lot of this stuff.
Right. So it seems that at the moment, buying into wokeism is a way that a lot of companies and corporations and Wall Street is, trying to distract consumers, trying to kind of put the blindfold on and also control markets at the same time. But, the wave will pass, and you guys are kind of fighting the wave of wokeism. So what do you think would be the next big problem? Because, corporate America is always going to be doing whatever it can to make money, even if it's at the expense of the consumer. So what are kind of problems down the pipeline that you see?
That's a great question. I'll say this. William F. Buckley had a great quote. He said, "The problem with socialism is socialism. The problem with capitalism is capitalists," meaning that people don't suddenly become angels when they step into a corporate boardroom. Just because they are supposed to be focused on making money through serving customers doesn't mean they won't come up with nefarious or duplicitous ways to try and cheat the system. And so it's incumbent upon anybody, even people who are ardent free market believers, and we don't frame it like that. We believe in consumer choice. That our focus is on the consumer, making sure the consumer has as many options and can find what they need in the marketplace at a reasonable price. But someone has to play referee. Someone has to play neighborhood watch. And I think that unfortunately in the last 20, 30 years, we have not done a good job as a country of calling balls and strikes, calling companies out publicly when we see it. We kind of figure, oh, that's a regulator's job. Oh, the FTC will get them, or the SEC will get them, or Consumer Product Safety Commission will get them. And that's unfortunately just a little bit, one, not how it works, and a little bit naive. There needs to be, obviously consumers research. We're going to be in the market and continuing to fulfill that role. But we hope that other people, consumers, will understand they need to day by day be playing that role of calling these companies out. So I don't know what the next big thing is. I hope that, once we fix this, corporate America will get back to what they're supposed to be doing, which is focusing on providing high quality goods and services that are at the lowest possible prices to America's consumers. But to your note, if they get into some other, crazy nonsense like equivalent to wokeism, we will be there calling them out, attacking them for it, and saying, no, that's not your job. Your job is to focus on the American consumer. So I don't know what it'll be, but we will be there attacking them for taking their eye off the ball.
Hoping to be the wake-up call.
Absolutely. Well, Will, thank you for joining us. I think the last thing that I want to ask you is, what can people like us do? What can normal people do to support what you guys are doing and to kind of back you in this effort to call out these corporations and put the consumer first once again?
Absolutely. Well, if they'd like to learn more, they can visit our website at consumersresearch.org. That's consumersresearch.org.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Will. We appreciate you being on. And for Will Hild, for Abby Liebing, I'm Grant Atkinson. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit that subscribe button or go to the westernjournal.com to read more articles about this sort of subject. All the reporting that we do is obviously to bring you more information. So thank you guys for supporting us and for tuning in today with Will Hild, and we will see you again next week.
Thanks so much.